We've all heard of Brexit. It was the single most monumental socio-economic and political decision undertaken in Europe in modern times. At the helm of this decision was the British public. Well, 51% of them at least. A marginal majority for sure, but a majority nonetheless. The 2016 polling results brought on more questions than it did answers. How, when, and why. But ultimately, it settled one thing once and for all. The United Kingdom would leave the European Union. Unless someone spent 2016 through 2020 living under a rock, they were bound to have heard of Brexit, no matter which corner of the world they lived in. If they hadn't heard of the term itself, or weren't able to grasp what the UK had done, they were able to feel the immediate after effects. Obviously, as one of the G7 with one of the strongest economies on the globe, the Great British Withdrawal didn't come without consequences. But what if those consequences were for the betterment of the European Union, maybe even the whole of Europe? When Great Britain was leaving the EU, negotiators were sent to work out the terms of their exit. Simply, a deal was to be made to ensure everyone benefited from Brexit. Yes, there were talks of a no-deal exit as well. Some even suggested a reversal of Brexit. But the decision had been made in 2016. Brexit happened, and now we're living in a post-Brexit world, several years on. The world didn't stop spinning, and the EU certainly didn't stop caring about its duties. Likewise, Europeans have continued going about their day. But has life changed for any of them? Surely it must have, and today, we're talking about just that. How is life different after Brexit? What is the European Union's biggest problem? Political dissolutions, threats of imminent war, refusal to comply with standardized policies, political corruption, social injustices. Take your pick, and it still wouldn't be the European Union's biggest problem. Actually, it would be a factor that contributes towards the EU's biggest problem. The real problem that the EU faces, the major hurdle that it's yet to overcome fully, would be Euroscepticism. While the name is self-explanatory, the term is officially defined as a political position that involves the criticism of the European Union as a unit, and European integration as a whole. A Eurosceptic would be someone who rejects standardized policies. If he or she rejects them with due cause, it would be classified as soft Euroscepticism. On the other hand, if the EU as a whole is believed to be unreformable, that would be classified as hard Euroscepticism. To give you some perspective on Euroscepticism by way of an example, Brexit was a decision undertaken by a majority of Eurosceptics in Great Britain. In 2016, their numbers outgrew the pro-Europeans. The decision, however, was a long time coming. Experts believe that the rising anti-EU sentiment in Britain came after years and years of complaints to the British Parliament on the rising influence of the EU. What problems could the British have with the EU? A range, actually. However, if we're going to narrow them down, threats of national sovereignty, the EU's lack of democratic legitimacy and transparency, the EU's bureaucratic principles which encourage high levels of immigration, and perceptions that this is a neoliberal organization serving the big business elite at the expense of the working class, that is responsible for austerity and drives privatization. But is Euroscepticism a British problem? No, it is not. In fact, all 27 remaining EU states have witnessed mass protests at some point during their EU membership, with calls from a growing number of people to end their membership in the alliance. Brexit is just the more popularized term. There has been Frexit, Nexit, Grexit, and other exits that have been chanted throughout EU membership. It is in fact the EU's biggest problem, the fact that people are unhappy with the governing body. Eurobarometer surveys of EU citizens show that trust in the EU and its institutions declined strongly from 2007 to 2015. In that period, it was constantly below 50%. A 2009 survey showed that support for EU membership was lowest in the United Kingdom, Latvia, and Hungary. By 2016, the countries viewing the EU most unfavorably were the UK, Greece, France, and Spain. It of course culminated with the UK leaving the EU. It's worth noting, though, that despite Brexit campaigning the way forward and the UK undertaking a decision that seemed like it was a long time coming for other member states, none of them followed suit. There was Brexit, but there hasn't been a subsequent Grexit, Frexit, or Spexit. Why not? While the UK's withdrawal from the EU seemed like the worst thing imaginable back in the day, it really wasn't. Yes, the UK contributed significantly to the EU's budget as one of the strongest economies in the alliance. But that was just one contributor. The EU still has France and Germany. What the UK doesn't have now is 12% of a population that seemed to champion Euroscepticism. Alternatively, the EU now has an example of what happens when you leave the alliance. To better understand this concept, we'd have to take a look at the numbers. Since 2015, trust in the EU, pro-Europeanism, has risen in almost every member state. This would be because of the end of the migrant crisis and the rising number of employment cases. A post-2019 election Eurobarometer survey showed that 68% of citizens support the EU, the highest level since 1983. Trust in the EU had increased significantly at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, with levels varying across member states. In the wake of the UK's vote to withdraw, opinion polls showed that support of the EU surged across Europe. Surveying shows that EU has the highest support in 35 years. The UK has also seen a resurgence of EU-based support, with polls showing that in September 2018, more British residents thought Brexit would be wrong, by 46% to 43%. By November 2020, 47% of respondents to a YouGov poll would vote to rejoin, compared with 38% committed to leave. By February 2021, the YouGov polls showed that the ratio had reversed. 39% of the UK electorate would wish to rejoin the EU, as against 41% who would vote against that option. The same poll showed pro-Remain majorities in Germany, France, Denmark, and Sweden. At the time of the referendum, there were concerns that Britain's exit from the EU would lead to a mass exodus of other member states and the eventual breakup of the Union. However, it seems as if most Europeans feel like the unity of the EU countries has not been affected by Brexit, and Britons overestimate the impact that Brexit has had on the unity of the remaining member states. A third of Britons think that the EU has become less united as a result of Brexit, compared to between 11% and 25% of the other 9 countries polled. 60% of Germans and 61% of Spaniards were twice as likely as 32% of Britons to say that Brexit has made no difference in the unity of the remaining member states of the EU, with similarly high numbers in Italy and Greece at 56% each, France at 52%, and Poland and Sweden at 50% each. If anything, 1 in 6 Spaniards think the EU has become more united as a result of Brexit. One of the major slogans seen across the mass demonstrations that championed Brexit was regarding immigration. The UK adopted an anti-immigration stance in the days leading up to the referendum, obviously after years and years of voicing their displeasure over the growing number of migrants in their country. To give you some perspective on this, Leave campaigners saw a lot of support in their cause in the small town of Boston, a town that had seen a 400% rise in Polish migration since Poland became a member state and made use of the free movement EU policy. The UK made its position clear. The country wanted to curb the migrant crisis. In 2016, the population of the UK was 65.61 million. In the year ending March 2016, EU net migration peaked at over 280,000, with more than 500,000 EU nationals moving to the UK. Brexit curbed the issue, in a way. Around the time of the Brexit referendum, the Office for National Statistics' main data releases suggest that EU citizens made up more than half of total net migration of non-UK citizens. Since that time, however, the picture has changed a lot, but maybe not in the way the UK wanted to. This would be a case of lost in translation. You see, while migration of one group has in fact decreased in the UK, migration of another group has risen dramatically, to the point where the ONS has had to announce a record high in net immigration in the years following the anti-immigration wave in the UK. Counterproductive, to say the least. EU net migration fell sharply after the referendum, while non-EU net migration increased. The result is that the most recent ONS estimates, which cover the year ending June 2022, EU citizens made no contribution to net migration at all. Indeed, net migration of EU citizens was slightly negative. It's worth noting that the British government did attempt to curb growing immigration. To say that they didn't would be inaccurate. On the other hand, to say that they didn't go about it in the right way would be accurate. You see, in the wake of the British withdrawal from the EU, Boris Johnson, a Leave campaigner and the future Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, announced that this would mark a new era in British immigration. How? This would pave the way for the UK to adopt its own immigration system, the points-based system, otherwise referred to as the Australian immigration system. To give you the gist of the system before detailing how it catastrophically failed, the system ascribes a certain number of points for people who seek to enter the United Kingdom based on what the government needs. Say there's been a shortage of pharmacists in the UK in a particular year. That would be the year the UK raises points for pharmacists. Other variables, such as speaking English as an example, remain constant. So how did this otherwise straightforward policy fail? And how did it help improve the EU's position even further? Contrary to the points system, the EU has a free movement system. That is, member state citizens can move freely between one country and another. This was a highly criticized system when Polish migration rose in the UK to a point that Polish migrants were the largest migrant class in the whole country. In any case, the British thought that they'd curbed the migrant crisis, but they didn't factor in one population: students. The largest driver of the overall increase in visa grants was sponsored students and their family members, who made up 316,000, or 42% of the total increase in visa grants from 2019 to 2022. The reason for the sharp increase in the number of international students coming to the UK remain uncertain. It is likely that the reintroduction of a post-study work visa post-Brexit has made the UK more attractive to international students, although it is difficult to know how much of the increase results from this policy change. There has also been an increase in family members of students. Of the total 316,000 increase in student visas issued to non-EU citizens, 62% was from main applicants, and 38% was from their parents or children receiving student-dependent visas. Many international students enter the UK on student visas ostensibly to pursue education, but some use this as a means to gain entry and then overstay their visa, effectively vanishing from the immigration system. This problem is linked to the weakness in the UK's student visa regulations, and concerns over compliance and enforcement have grown in recent years. In 2021, Home Office figures revealed that the number of international students entering the UK had reached a record high, with over 400,000 new student visas issued, marking a sharp rise. However, a significant number of these students did not leave the UK after completing their courses or when their visa expired. Data from 2019, before the pandemic disrupted migration patterns, showed that around 15% of international students overstayed their visa, amounting to tens of thousands of individuals remaining in the UK illegally. This situation is exacerbated by the UK's overabundant immigration system, which struggles to track and enforce visa compliance once students are inside the country. Students who overstay often find ways to live off the grid, avoiding immigration enforcement by working in cash-based or informal sectors of the economy. In cities like London, Birmingham, and Manchester, illegal work markets provide an environment where overstayers can hide, often with the complicity of exploitative employers. This not only makes it difficult for immigration authorities to locate and remove overstayers, but it also places these individuals at risk of exploitation and unsafe working conditions. Universities and private colleges, particularly less reputable institutions, have sometimes been complicit in this problem. Some institutions have been accused of admitting international students with insufficient academic credentials or language skills, knowing that many more are interested in gaining entry to the UK than obtaining an education. This has led to concerns over bogus institutions being set up specifically to exploit the student visa system. In 2018, a crackdown on such institutions resulted in the revocation of 460 sponsor licenses, allowing fewer colleges to admit international students. But challenges persist. In a nutshell, guess EU migration wasn't the issue after all. You best believe that the UK had one card up its sleeve, and they played it for as long as they could. In 2016, at the time when Brexit was announced, the UK's contribution to the EU budget, taking into account the rebate, was close to 20 billion euros. For context, it would take the average person 31 years, 251 days, 7 hours, 46 minutes, and 40 seconds to count that far. Simply, the UK contributed a lot to the UK's budget, as one of the strongest economies in the member states. Yes, France and Germany remained the major contributors, as they did after Brexit, but to undermine Britain's contribution would be impractical. In any case, the EU reportedly lost 5% of its total budget as a result of Brexit. The numbers take into account the 7 billion euros that the UK would receive in EU subsidies. For Germany, this meant that as the largest contributor, the country would be asked to provide an additional 2.5 billion euros to make up for the imbalance. You'd be right to think that the budget was another major reason why the British public wanted out of the EU. Simply a few nations made up the majority of the budget. Yes, they made up a majority of these subsidies as well, but the numbers were never balanced well enough. This was Britain's best card, as reiterated by Nigel Farage and David Davis, who claimed that the EU needs us more than we need them. Is that true? Not according to the French and German populations, who, by the way, footed the Brexit bill. Half of Germans and half of French people say Brexit has not made a difference to the EU's economy, while a quarter and a fifth respectively say Brexit has made the EU's economy worse off. British people were split evenly between Brexit having no impact on the EU and the EU being economically worse off as a result of Brexit. Danish people were similarly split by 34% to 35%. Ever since Brexit took place in 2020, there have been polls that determine the Eurosceptic behavior in the UK. Yes, at the time of the withdrawal, it was at an all-time high, which makes sense considering the outcome of the referendum. However, times have changed. While there are populations who believe that Brexit was the right move, their numbers have been on a sharp decline after 2020. Many factors come into play here. Immigration and the economy would be just two of them. In any case, polling found that support of the idea of rejoining the EU has drifted up throughout 2022, from 49% in favor of rejoining in February to 56% in December. Support for rejoin has risen sharply among voters under 45, while older voters are much less likely to have changed their mind. Currently, just under 1 in 5 of 2016 Leave voters say they would hypothetically back the idea of a rejoin. 12% of Remainers would opt to stay out. Those who did not vote would back rejoining by a ratio of 4 to 1. That being said, is rejoining the EU possible? It is. However, not without retribution. The EU can deny entry into the alliance based on a set of principles and guidelines that include, among other things, rule of law and transparency. The UK doesn't have those problems. Its only problem is its volatility, something which the EU would demand be curbed before the country is accepted readmission. But would member states readily accept the UK back? Is it really that easy? Not particularly, no. If anything, many believe that the strength of the EU, as it stands today, is because of Brexit. Reversing a decision that helped it become more favorable could be seen as counterproductive. On the other hand, it could also showcase how countries that leave the EU always come back. Will the UK ever come back? We'll have to wait and watch.